What's up, everybody? It's me, Coach Mills here, and today we're going to be breaking down the Ultimate Season 2 tier list for Overwatch tanks, DPS, and supports, breaking down all of the best and worst options for this meta. With the hotfix patch, Ramatra being added to competitive, and a ton of different changes that people are finally adjusting to, we're going to break it all down so you get a big picture of the meta. But do me a huge solid and smash that subscribe button. We are so close to 50,000 subscribers, I can almost taste it. So if you've been enjoying the content, do me a huge solid and smash that subscribe, and let's get into the video. Now, as we know, every single meta is defined by tanks and what tanks are powerful. So let's talk about the strongest to weakest tanks. First off, in the C tier, we have two tanks, Wrecking Ball and Junker Queen. Now, Wrecking Ball has been unchanged since the last tier list, and Junker Queen was moved down from the B tier to the C tier. Now, I want to make it incredibly clear right now, unlike the other roles, the weakest tanks right now are still quite strong in the right hands. Wrecking Ball is potentially an unkillable target against certain compositions, and if a player learns to master the complicated text behind Wrecking Ball, it can be a much better option to some of the other dive characters like D.Va or Winston. Now, as far as Junker Queen is concerned, there are just too many tanks that have a leg up on Junker Queen in the direct matchup in her current power level state. We do know that buffs are coming down the pipeline, but if you're a god at Junker Queen and you're not in the top ranks, Junker Queen can still absolutely body with a ton of skill expression. So if you want to play Junker Queen, practicing her now could set you up for her in the future when she gets buffs, and she can still body at the majority of ranks, so keep those things in mind. Next up, let's talk about the B tier. And we have three characters in the B tier for tanks: Zarya, Reinhardt, and D.Va. Both Reinhardt and D.Va being moved down from the A tier. First off, let's talk about D.Va. If a map has a lot of verticality, D.Va automatically becomes much stronger and can be closer to an A tier level tank in that environment. On top of that, she's really good at shutting down certain types of utility, like an on a nade, or just diving hit scan DPS like an Ashe or a Widowmaker. D.Va also can play a very peel heavy style of gameplay, keeping her teammates alive, protecting them, and ultimately stopping things like Roadhog Hook or preventing an Orisa from bursting down a teammate. If D.Va is mastered, D.Va can become an insane threat, capable of carrying you all the way to Grandmaster and beyond. But I would say D.Va is the definition of fair right now. There's nothing overly overpowered about the character, and while you can definitely enable your team, you can't hard carry nearly as much as some of the other options in the higher tiers, so for that reason, she's in the B tier. Now, Reinhardt is still a phenomenal pick, especially the lower in rank you go. Having players that want to play around a Reinhardt and enable him is fantastic, especially if you have a way to get in, like a Kirko Rush or a Lucio just speeding you around. That being said, Reinhardt can be absolutely bullied by some of the tanks higher up on this list. A Sigma can outdistance you and just poke you down. A Doomfist basically can make you his personal punching bag. And of course, Roadhog can just keep whole hogging you into oblivion. There's a lot of these characters that don't really care about what Rein is trying to do, especially when the tanks are mastered. So in the head-to-head, Rein is lacking quite a bit, but I do think that he still can be a decent pick, and there are players that still currently play Rein at the highest level in Grandmaster. But moving on to the last character that we have in the B tier, we have Zarya. And unfortunately, Zarya has quite a few bad matchups or just not great matchups. While she's definitely not completely unplayable, especially on certain maps like King's Row, if there's any verticality, Zarya becomes terrible, and against a lot of characters, Zarya just feels pretty underpowered. Slow to get charge, and it can be pretty difficult to properly balance everything you need to between using bubbles to peel for your team, bubbles to create you charge, or bubbles to enable your aggressive plays. I think the best thing going for Zarya right now is the fact that she is a natural counter to Orisa, who has grown to be one of the most powerful characters in the game. So oftentimes you could play this rock paper scissors matchup where if the enemy walks in on Orisa and you're out on Hog, the Orisa counters you, shuts you down, you go swap to Zarya, play against the Orisa, but then the Orisa swaps to something different, and it's just like swap after swap after swap. But having Zarya in your pool as a character to use and choose from can be fantastic, and then occasionally you'll get into that Zarya mirror and you can just diff them, which is great. Next up, we got to talk about the A tier, and there are three characters in the A tier. This is Ramatra, Doomfist, and Sigma. Ramatra moved up from C, Doomfist moved down from S. and Sigma sitting there, sitting pretty right where he belongs. Now, Ramatra is a very powerful character now with these buffs. The movement buffs make Ramatra a legitimate threat, and Ramatra is going to be powerful, although it is important to understand that Ramatra has a lot of key weaknesses. Ramatra isn't very good against characters that want to dive past Ramatra with not great forms of CC or ways to punish a tank coming in. On top of that, Ramatra isn't that great in the head-to-head up against things like a Roadhog Whole Hog, for instance. So when Ramatra has both weaknesses to dive and weaknesses to characters that want to brawl on the front line with no legitimate form of stun, Ramatra could be used as a hybrid to enable a poke and pressure slash brawl playstyle. I could see centering around maybe a hit scan DPS and a Reaper, hypothetically, but Ramatra is going to be very difficult to master and play, especially with it coming out so recently. I would imagine that the majority of Ramatras are just going to play Ramatra worse than a lot of the other options, but if you could unlock this character very quickly and learn to differ between that poke and brawl playstyle at the appropriate times, you can get a lot of value on this character very quickly. Now, of course, Doomfist was S tier, received a ton of nerfs, but I think the news that Doomfist is dead is long overblown. Doomfist still has some pretty good matchups. Not great against a character like Orisa, of course, but Doomfist isn't quite that bad against characters like Sigma, can probably bully a character like Ramatra, and is fantastic against characters like Rhine. Doomfist also plays really well with some compositions if you have certain DPS that want to follow up with you, like a Reaper or a Tracer, or certain supports that actually want to enable you to get pickoffs, like a Zen with the Discord Orb, Doomfist can be fantastic in the right hands. I want to make this clear that you have to still know how to play Doomfist properly, and Doomfist is a lot harder to play than they were before. And I will say, as players play the meta more and more, the higher up you climb, the worse Doomfist become. But if we take the conjunction of all the ranks combined, learning to master Doomfist can definitely be worthwhile as another tank to add to your overall tank flex pool. Now, next up in the A tier, borderline S tier, is definitely Sigma. Now, Sigma is going to be really strong on maps with long distance poke and chokes. And I would say for the most part, he doesn't have completely terrible matchups. A lot of matchups Sigma can kind of make do, simply due to the fact that he can keep kiting back, poking, playing for his ultimate, and if enemies want to come in and fight on their terms, he still has his rock to shut that down. Sigma's a very powerful character that can absolutely create a ton of pressure, but you also got to understand that Sigma is a character that really wants to play with certain types of characters. If you don't have a character that can poke with you and aid you, then oftentimes Sigma won't be the right pick. And on top of that, if there's verticality or on a lot of these Koth maps where the enemies can come from multiple directions, Sigma starts to struggle. He really wants everyone to be towards one direction and not fighting people all around him. So he has a natural weakness to characters that want to swarm him, and that is one of the big things that you need to know if you want to play Sigma. Now, last up, we got to talk about the S tier. And there's one tank in the S tier that I actually think most people will disagree with me on. A lot of people might disagree with me on, I know this for a fact, but I'm actually putting Winston at the bottom of the S tier. Now, you might be a little bit confused about why I would put Winston in the S tier if Winston has some pretty hard counters, notably Roadhog that could just completely shut a Winston down. But when we think about the tank meta as a rock, paper, scissors contest, I mean, a lot more complicated than that, but every tank has a strong matchup and a very weak matchup. While Winston has a very weak matchup to Roadhog, Winston has a very strong matchup to characters like Orisa and the characters that are played with Orisa. A pretty good matchup against characters like Sigma, a good matchup against a character like Ramatra. And the reason that Winston has good matchups here is because Winston just ignores these tanks. He sets himself up, finds a surgical way to get it on the enemy backline, applies pressure, and either jumps out or he goes in for more and gets pickoffs. And the enemy, Orisa or Sigma or whoever he's diving, can do little to nothing about it. Oftentimes, a lot of these characters want you to fight in a very linear way on the front line, but Winston thrives by surgically picking off the primary way that these characters stay alive. And Orisa wants you to fight her all day and will happily brawl you on the front line non-stop, but Winston's not interested in that. So to zoom out of this a little bit and give it more context, Orisa was moved up from B tier to S tier based on the buffs that she received, and Roadhog is still in the S tier. Orisa being incredibly powerful, very, very strong just stats wise, and very good at shutting down characters like Roadhog. Roadhog's good generally against a lot of different characters, but Orisa shuts the Roadhog down, and when people swap to Orisa, oftentimes you are going to be forced to swap off that hog, but Winston is really good against the Orisa, especially if you have DPS that can actually follow up your damage that you create. So if you're walking into this meta blind, I think that Roadhog, Orisa, and Winston are the best 3 tanks that you can have in your back pocket to know, learn, and master. Not to mention, Winston gets extra stock on certain Koth maps like Ilios and on maps that have natural high ground. But I would still put Winston quite a bit below Roadhog and Orisa on the S tier. I think that Roadhog and Orisa are far and away the best tanks, but Winston still deserves a slot above the other characters I put in the A tier. But let me know if you agree or disagree with any of my listings, and let's jump over to the DPS. Now, for the DPS, at the bottom of the DPS list, we have Bastion. Unfortunately, Bastion is in the D tier, and Bastion is only here because Bastion has really notable weaknesses that can be exploited in a way that other characters simply can't. Now, is Bastion unplayable? No. In fact, a good Bastion that knows how to properly position and has a team that supports the Bastion can completely dominate some matchups and some characters, bursting down targets, getting a ton of pickoffs, and just being an all-around threat. But the reality of Bastion, when we look at them compared to a lot of the tanks that can just shut them down, a good tank, whether it's an Orisa, a Roadhog, a Sigma, a D.Va, or the list goes on, can all harass the Bastion and put a lot of pressure into him. On top of that, Ana has just seen a huge stonk increase, and both Sleep Dart and Nade are incredibly effective against the Bastion, and you don't want your Kiriko just permanently Suzing the Bastion when you have like a Roadhog on your team, hypothetically, that needs those Suzu resources instead. So I'm going to put him down in the D tier. Still playable, but you need him a little bit more optimized situations than some of these other characters. Next up in the C tier, we have Hanzo, Sombra, Symmetra, and Genji. Genji got moved down from the B tier, and each of these characters just are lacking in some way, or there's another character that could do their job better. I will say that Symmetra is a character that could be argued to be a higher tier, has a very high rank in the low tiers of play, and when players master Symmetra, they can do some really wild things. A character that basically transforms your creativity into playmaking potential, and especially when you combine it with like an Orisa, I think that brawling on the front line really aids the Symmetra's playstyle. So you put all those things into account, and I think Symmetra's stock rises, but a lot of that is going to depend on you. Symmetra's a character that isn't very intuitive to learn, and the playmaking potential is so wide and vast that it's really easy to do very little on this character as well. So I'm going to put it in a character that deserves very specific attention and mastery, but if you learn those things, you could be a god. Now, Sombra can shut down characters like Doom, put extra pressure on characters like Wrecking Ball, but for her base level stats, just simply underpowered compared to many of the other options in the game. And Hanzo, bug aside, is just a simply underpowered character compared to many of the other long-range poke options. And when you compare him directly into the head-to-head with characters like Widowmaker, Hanzo just feels a little lackluster, especially with the movement passive removed and the reload passive buffed. Hanzo gets no benefit from, so it's unfortunate, but he probably needs some buffs to compensate. Now, next up, we got to talk about the B tier. We have Cassidy, Soldier, Pharah, and Mei moved up from C tier. Now, Cassidy actually is pretty decent at both punishing characters like Hog and pressuring with a character like Orisa. A frontline brawler is exactly what Cassidy wants, and these are things that increase Cassidy's stock, but there are several characters that keep Cassidy in check, specifically characters like Widowmaker and characters like Ashe that can outrange the Cassidy and put a ton of pressure on him. I will say that a really expert Cassidy can definitely find more value in this meta right now than any other meta before, but he's still a bit underpowered compared to some of the other options. Soldier 76 is a character that definitely can find value in this meta, flanking around, trying to find key pickoffs and situation to provide pressure into, and most of the time, he's going to want to completely ignore that Orisa and look for pickoffs or pressure on the enemy backline. I will say that a soldier needs really expert aim, making sure to position himself away from things that want to kill him, like a Roadhog flanking, and potentially some amount of characters that want to aid him in in his quest to dominate the backline. But if those things all line up, Soldier can be a fantastic pick. Next up is Pharah, which is basically going to be dependent on whether or not you have a Mercy. Playing a Pharah without a Mercy in this meta can be pretty brutal, but an expert Pharah on the right map can simply dominate. Take a Koth map, take any map with verticality, and Pharah can have the time of her life. Although there are some maps with wide open skies and not a lot of vertical cover, those maps, especially many of these push maps, are simply pretty hard for Pharah to get value on. But on the flip side, there are some maps that are fantastic for Pharah. So I would say you can't really one-trick Pharah unless you're freaking Yesnia, but you should have her in your back pocket and still get competent with her for those maps. Last up is Mei, which might be a surprising choice. I do think that Mei has kind of lost her identity going into Overwatch 2. That being said, the wall still gives you a ton of potential to basically pick off these tanks and bully them. Whether you're walling a Roadhog or walling off an Orisa, you can get a ton of value. And one of the most underrated DPS that's going to help in the Hog v Hog matchup is actually Mei. Something that you might not know about the Hog v Hog matchup is it's super dependent right now on the support lineup. If you have a Hog that has like a Lucio Mercy and another Hog that has a Ana Kiriko, the Hog with an Ana Kiriko will win every single time if those supports enable the Hog. Because if the other Hog ever hits a hook, he's going to get slept, naded, your Hog's going to get cleansed, and yeah, it's just freaking game over. But Mei can change that matchup quite severely by helping the Hog follow up on the other Hog when the hook happens and walling off that Hog to prevent him from getting Suzu, from getting nade. It's a very underrated strategy, but if you're a DPS player that wants to help out your Hog counterpart, Mei can be the great character to do it, and on some maps with choke points, Mei can be a super underrated pick. Next up, we have the A tier, and there are 4 characters in the A tier: Sojourn, Torb, Tracer that got moved down from S tier, and Ashe. Now, Sojourn, surprise, surprise, is still pretty powerful. If you can unlock the skill of rail, or even just hitting body shot rails, Sojourn is a very good poker, can burst down opponents, and has great mobility. Very powerful, and if you get a Mercy pocket, all of a sudden you become one of the best, if not the best DPS in the entire game. Sojourn is incredible. Don't sleep on this character just because it's gotten nerfs. Honestly, still one of the best DPS, period. Now, Torb's an interesting one. Torb actually plays really well into like a brawl against characters like Roadhog, against characters like Orisa, just playing with your Roadhog and your Orisa, just poking out the enemy, applying a ton of pressure, and being a character that is pretty hard for Roadhog or Orisa to insta-kill, which is a good thing. I will say that your hitbox is a little big, though, against Orisa's primary fire, so be careful of that. Don't get caught without your E in her line of sight. Now, in general, though, Torb also gets a huge buff up the lower in rank you go, having very high win rates in the lowest ranks. So if you're trying to cheat code your way out of some of these lower ranks, Torb is a great character to play, although you might not develop your skills and then you'll struggle on anything else. Once you get to the higher ranks, don't use this tip to become a Torb one trick. Next up is Tracer, down from S tier. Tracer did receive that 0.5 damage buff, which is actually a big deal on Tracer. And while Tracer is still good in the right hands, you got to think about all the characters that could threaten a Tracer, whether it's freaking Ana 2-tapping you, Kiriko headshotting you. All these characters have ways to interact with you, like Roadhog Hook, or a ton of the different DPS like Ashe or Widowmaker can all one-shot you. Tracer has a lot of threats, but if you're skillful enough, you can play around them, and that's why Tracer's in the A tier, but she's no longer the one-clip powerhouse that she was previously. Still strong, though. Next up, we got to talk about Ashe. Ashe is a character that has gotten the best amount of buffs from the reload passive. Now that it's up to 35%, Ashe is just insane. Has a huge amount of uptime, and one of the freaking best characters to consistently apply pressure. Only down in this A tier because there are a couple of characters up higher that actually counter this Ashe, and Ashe doesn't have any one-tap potential, so these things hold her back slightly, but she's still a phenomenal character, and Bob can create a ton of value right now in a 5v5 environment. So yeah, Ashe gets put towards the top of the A tier. Next up in the S tier, from the bottom to the top, we have Echo, Junkrat, Reaper, and Widowmaker. Now, this might be another controversial S tier, but let me explain. First off with Echo, a severely underrated threat that can do both. poke enemies in a brawl composition, looking for an opportunity and punishing enemies with her beam, or diving in with the dive character and going aggressive trying to make plays. Echo can also play a much more proactive playstyle with a pocket, or a much more passive playstyle, a ground Echo, depending on your composition. And Echo's ultimate is one of the best ultimates in the game, capable of winning a fight all by itself. I think Echo is severely slept on, primarily because not a lot of people are playing Echo, and not a lot of people are good at Echo, so they severely underrate the character, even though Echo is very, very strong, although very hard to master. Next up, we do got to talk about Junkrat. Junkrat got moved up from the A tier as he's slowly becoming just a phenomenal character. I mean, he's fantastic at bursting down targets, punishing enemy tanks, and putting out consistent damage. And we're seeing Junkrats just climb higher and higher in the ranks. And especially when a Junkrat can burst down a Roadhog that's out of position, actually kill an Orisa. Like, how many freaking characters can actually kill an Orisa and then punish the majority of the tanking roster against characters that want to poke, like Ramattra and Sigma, can poke better than anyone. So Junkrat's fantastic and a great addition to any DPS lineup. Next up, we do got to talk about that Reaper. Reaper's really strong, and I think a lot of people are all of a sudden sleeping on Reaper when they shouldn't be. While Reaper does have to dodge things like Javelin and a hook and things like that, Reaper can punish enemies if he does dodge them, and he has the means to. He has his fade. And a Reaper paired with an Ana is a super deadly combo right now. And you can just eat up these tanks for breakfast. And I do think that Reaper also has great 1v1 matchups against supports and DPS. So you combine all these things together, and Reaper's very, very strong in the right hands. Also, don't sleep on Reaper at all. And last up in the S tier, I have Widowmaker. And I think Widowmaker is the best DPS right now. And it's not particularly close at the highest ranks of play. Of course, Widow's biggest downside is her incredibly high skill floor. It's very hard to get even a base level of value on the character unless you have mechanically gotten really good at her. And that's why Widowmaker won't be that dominant for the majority of ranks. But right now, how the top meta has formed is one-taps are insane. Whether a Roadhog is getting one-taps and being able to one-tap yourself, especially outside of his effective range, very, very strong. Or an Orisa that wants you to brawl her infinitely on the front line, completely ignoring her, just like how I said a Winston wants to ignore her and jump the back line. A Widowmaker can ignore her by taking an off angle and sniping her back line. And the Orisa can do nothing about it. And that's a fantastic thing from the Widowmaker's perspective. A Widowmaker that gets a one-shot, instantly kills a target on a scoped-in Widow or a freaking Kiriko, gives the enemy no time to mitigate, brawl, use their utility, use their Suzu. The fight's just over. The matchup's just done. And of course, Widowmaker is hard to play, but I think that if you master Widowmaker, it's the best DPS right now. Very freaking strong. But of course, we got to move on to the supports. At the bottom of the barrel, unfortunately, we have Brig. Now, Brig is already slated to get a complete rework to her ultimate, but in the current state, Brig is just a little bit underpowered compared to many of the other characters in the game. Brig just is a character that is supposed to be big, brawly, and tanky, but oftentimes she can be killed. She can be one-shot, her shield can be pressured very easily, and she can be dove. So she's not really the all-purpose brawling threat that she used to be. But a lot of times, Brig isn't punished depending on the rank you're at because players still have that perception about Brig. They don't understand when and where they can punish her. So you can definitely abuse that to get some value on her, but I think that other characters are worth more time in mastering right now currently. Next up is the C tier, and we have Moira. And Moira, the lower in rank you go, same thing, the better and better she is. I think that especially if you're being heavily pressured and dove and you get no peel, Moira can be fantastic, and you can just hard carry games if you're really good at this character. But the higher and higher you climb, and the more and more you play against meta, the more you realize that the utility that these other supports are bringing to the table, you just can't match a Moira. Like, Moira can do damage, and she can heal. That's it. Lucio can speed the team around. Fantastic ability. Mercy can res and damage alter her team, which is fantastic. Ana can literally cancel healing and sleep targets, putting them in a stasis, and Kiriko can save anyone from anything. These are the type of abilities we're talking about, and Moira can damage and Moira can heal. And while she can survive, a lot of these characters can as well. So unfortunately, I think that she definitely teeters off in ceiling of value, but her floor of value is pretty high. Next off in the B tier, we have Zen and we have Baptiste. Baptiste moved up from the C tier. Zen is actually pretty good in poke compositions. You're playing with the Sigma and you want to poke the enemy. Or maybe you're playing with a Ramatra and you want to poke. Zen's actually pretty good, although Zen is vulnerable. And there's certain DPS and tanks that can make your life an absolute hell. I will say that there's two important factors about Zen. One, how good your positioning is and how safe you can position, how hard you can make it for enemies to punish you. And two, how much pressure are the enemy team putting on you. It's important to not expect peel in your games because you're probably not going to get it. And if you become a really easy target for the enemy team, then oftentimes it might be time to swap that up. But in the right circumstance, Zen could be an absolute god. Now, of course, Baptiste also gets better because Baptiste is actually really good at pocketing an Orisa. Surprise, surprise. And Baptiste is good in poke compositions like with the Sigma. So in situations like that, Baptiste can get a ton of value, get team fight wins, or build ultimate for their team with amplification matrix, and just rack up a ton of healing and sustain for that Orisa on the front line. But let's move on to the A tier with two characters in the A tier. First off, we have Mercy, and then we have Lucio. Now, before you raise your pitchforks, Lucio mains, I want to make it clear that I think Lucio is S tier in the Grandmaster rank, and probably Masters as well. But if I take the average of all ranks combined, Lucio, unfortunately, isn't going to be the easiest way to get wins, because the easiest way to get wins is enabling a Roadhog. And there's two characters that do that really well, Kiriko and Ana, but we'll get to that in a second. Lucio is also a character where the lower in rank you go, the less and less people play properly around your speed and utilize it correctly and have joint pushes. So Lucio naturally is probably S tier in a triple stack, naturally S tier in a game with a lot of comms and communication, and S tier in a game that is higher in level. But if none of those things are true, then Lucio falls down to A tier. Still capable of peeling, has a fantastic ultimate, and you can make plays yourself, but not quite as strong as solo carrying as some of these other options. Now, Mercy is a character that has slowly but surely become better and better, and it all has to do with how this meta has kind of evolved into a one-tap meta. Characters get one-tapped, and Mercy can erase that one-tap. On top of that, Mercy can enable a ton of DPS to be even more powerful. Junkrat, Widowmaker, the res is very impactful. Echo Pocket, Sojourn Pocket, Ash Pocket. Basically, in a one-tap meta or a pick-off meta, Mercy can undo pickoffs that happen and aid her team in getting pickoffs. So she just really fits perfectly in this meta. But I would say know what DPS you have and know if they are actually worth pocketing and enabling. Because while Mercy can definitely dominate if your DPS are aiding you and y'all are working together, if you have a tank that is absolutely dominating and your DPS are kind of struggling, it's probably better for you to enable the tank instead with another pick. Next off, in the S tier, we have two characters, Kiriko and Ana. Now, Ana has risen up from the B tier, and for the majority of ranks, Ana is going to be an absolute god. I would say when you get to the highest ranks and Kirikos get good at shutting down an Ana definitely falls off a bit, but Ana is going to be this ever-present threat that is not only going to keep characters like Roadhog in check, but can make a ton of plays herself. And Ana is phenomenal at carrying you right now if you learn to master her. Capable of dueling targets with unlimited range. Capable of having impactful both sleeps and nades. And if you play around the enemy Kiriko, you can simply dominate and get a ton of freaking value. Although you have to be very careful of your positioning and make sure that you relocate periodically so that you never get caught out. And then last, we do got to talk about Kiriko with an ultimate that is still a 10 out of 10 even after the nerfs. The capability to save any teammate, frag yourself, and you can just have so much goddamn impact over the game. It's ridiculous. Was anyone surprised that Kiriko is in this S tier? Although, I will say that you don't truly learn to unlock the potential of Kiriko unless you become somewhat mechanically competent, but that's true for characters like Ana as well. Now, before we wrap things up, I want to make it clear that tier lists are just suggestions about the meta. And I am confident that one tricks over any of the characters in this tier list could still get to Grandmaster. So if you're not yet in Grandmaster and you want to climb to Grandmaster, don't let my freaking tier list tell you what not to or to play. But I do want to give you some more insight into what is played at the top of the meta, and you can make the decision for yourself now that you're informed. But if you enjoyed this content, do me a huge solid and smash that like and subscribe, and let me know what you want to see next in the comments down below. Thank you so much for coming by, and we'll see you next time.